Hi Founder fans, Jason here. Welcome to Federalist Read-Alongs. Today we are discussing Federalist number 32 by Alexander Hamilton. It's a continuation, the third consecutive paper by Hamilton, which regards the powers of taxation of the United States government. Again, at this point, just to recap, Hamilton spent several papers discussing why we need a powerful army and navy, which could only be provided by a national government, and he has continued by discussing why there needs to be the unlimited power of taxation in all cases whatsoever for said government to arrive. With that in mind, we will pop up the big old board here, where we will look at Federalist number 32, the same subject, continued, concerning the general power of taxation, for the Daily Advertiser, January 3rd, 1788, 2 days later, by Alexander Hamilton. I want to note, the Daily Advertiser is the paper it was published in this time. For the first several papers, up to about number 30, he and Hamilton and John Jay would alternate between the New York New York Packet and the New York Intelligencer. Am I saying that right? The Examiner, I believe it is. I apologize. Got a little twisted in my mind there. He went to the Daily Advertiser just in number 30, I believe it was, and now we're back. So, Daily Advertiser getting some recognition. With that in mind, let's scroll down just a little bit here. As always, to the people of the state of New York. These were written in New York. To the people of New York, unless this is your first time, you would know that. Also, if this is your first time, feel free to head down below to the link in the description where you can read along with me, and we will be going line by line, sentence by sentence, to get through these papers. Now, this first sentence is real long, so we're going to cut it down just a little bit. And I'll remind you also, while I have read these in the past, it's been a little bit of a while, so it's a bit of a fresh read along for me along with you. Although I am and easy for me to say right off the bat, although I am of the opinion, let's get it this time, although I am of opinion that there would be no real danger of the consequences which seem to be apprehended to the state governments from a power in the Union to control them in levies of money, because I am persuaded that the sense of the people, the extreme hazard of provoking the resentments of state governments, and a conviction of the utility and necessity of local administrations for local purposes would be a complete barrier against the oppressive use of such a power, ... This opening part of this very lengthy first sentence is a recap of the previous paper. So just to recap, he thinks there's nothing that the states or the people have to fear by giving a unlimited power of taxation to the national government. And he's saying this because, first of all, the sense of the people wouldn't let it happen. You know, because the people will be able to control the federal government, of course. The extreme hazard of provoking the resentments of the state governments. Now, this is a little bit of better argument that, you know, if the states are a major part of the system, which they were meant to be, although many of the Anti-Federalists were nervous that they would be taxed out of existence, Hamilton acknowledges that it would be dangerous for the national government to make such enemies of the states themselves. And a conviction of the utility and necessity of local administrations for local purposes. He says no matter what really happens, the local governments really will be the most important in people's lives. And believe it or not, day to day, they still pretty much are. Most of your daily laws, your local taxes, your school systems, a lot of that, not all of it, don't quote me on it, a lot of that does still come from local administrations. And because of that, he thought that the people, through their local governments, would then have power over the states at large. Okay. Would be a barrier against such oppressive power. So those things would stop that from happening. Continuing this very long sentence, yet, despite the fact Hamilton is not concerned at all, I am willing here to allow in its full extent the justness of the reasoning which requires that the individual states should possess an independent and uncontrollable authority to raise their own revenue for the supply of their own wants. So what he's saying here is, even though the federal government should have the unlimited power of taxation, he acknowledges that the states, likewise, over their own people, should also have the power to tax however they want, or raise funds however they see fit. Continuing with another long sentence, and making this concession, I affirm, With the sole exception of duties on imports and exports, they would, under the plan of the convention, retain that authority in the most absolute and unqualified sense, and that an attempt on the part of the national government to abridge them in the exercise of it would be a violent assumption of power, unwarranted by any article or clause of its constitution. So, to elaborate, Hamilton's saying, since I'm being a nice guy and acknowledging something that everyone pretty much agrees on, he notes, with the exception of imports and exports, import duties, anything being imported should be taxed and exported should be taxed, which most people agreed with, even the Anti-Federalist, though it was pointed out to me recently that this was a major complaint leading up to the American Revolution, that they didn't want, they didn't mind import taxes, they just didn't want internal taxes. So what made the Stamp Act so vile to people is that was something people were buying locally and pretty much making locally. Why would the king have any right over that, or Parliament have any right over that? Though someone pointed out that once they start taxing the tea, people start throwing the tea in the harbor, but the tea was being imported from China. So a little bit hypocritical on the revolutionaries' part, but I digress. They would, under the plan of the convention, so in the Constitution, the states still have the authority, other than imports and exports, to raise money however they want to. And he's acknowledging that if the national government was trying to attempt to stop the states from raising money in a proper fashion, then that would be, as he says, a violent assumption of power. Not actual violence, but an assumption of power that it doesn't deserve. And additionally, he says it's not warranted by the Constitution. Now, the Constitution doesn't say it can't do that, would be an anti-federalist argument, but how are you supposed to prove a double negative? Continuing. An entire consolidation of the states into one complete national sovereignty would imply an entire subordination of the parts, and whatever powers might remain in them would be altogether dependent on the general will. So, if you were to do what many anti-federalists were very afraid would happen, where you eliminate the states altogether and consolidate them into just one government, it would be dependent on the general will. So that power, the powers of the national government doing that, would have to rely on the people. The people would basically be supporting that kind of transaction, we'll call it. He continues here. But as the plan of the convention aims only at partial union or consolidation, the state governments would clearly retain all the rights of sovereignty which they before had, and which were not, by that act, exclusively delegated to the United States. Now, I'll remind you, these are his capitals, not mine. So he's saying that only the things that are exclusively given power to the federal government, everything else stays with the states. That, the Federalists usually argued, was one of the brilliant parts of the system. The thing that kept the United States from falling into tyranny is you had these two governmental systems, the state governments and the national governments, both vying for power from each other. Of course, I always have to point out that the Anti-Federalists would have argued, well, what about the necessary and proper clause, where the government can do anything it wants if it deems it necessary and proper, and the supremacy clause, making the federal government the supreme government. That being said, Hamilton would argue that it is not explicitly stated. Well, that is explicitly stated, but but the powers themselves, the powers the state has, cannot be taken away because the federal government doesn't necessarily have the power to take from the states. Again, it's semantics, it's kind of a circled argument that they would go in, but we'll continue. This exclusive delegation, or rather, this alienation of state sovereignty, would only exist in 3 cases. So, you know what? We'll break it down in a second. Where the Constitution in express terms granted an exclusive authority to the Union, where it granted one instance an authority to the Union, and in another prohibited the states from exercising the like authority, and where it granted authority to the Union to which a similar authority in the states would be absolutely and totally contradictory and repugnant. So, to break this long sentence down, he's got a lot of long sentences today. Any problem with state sovereignty, with the states being able to do whatever they want, would only conflict with the Constitution in 3 situations. And he breaks these down. The first situation where state power might conflict with national power is where the Constitution in express terms granted an exclusive right to the Union. So anything that the Constitution says the national government can do this and the states can't. Obviously, the states can't do that. Where in the second example is, oh, I'm sorry, cut it a little short. A second example is where a power was granted sometimes to the Union and taken away from the states, so prohibited by the states. And then the third is where it is granted to the Union where a similar authority would be contradictory or repugnant. I'm sorry. So, just to wrap up, the 3 points where power between the states and the federal government might conflict is when the Constitution says only the Union can do this, the states can't. In another one, it's where one instance an authority to the Union and another prohibited the states from exercising it. And a granted authority to the Union where a similar authority in the states... Okay. He's kind of repeating himself with these second two. The first one, as I said, Union gets to do this. They have power. States don't. The second one, yeah, okay, the authorities granted... No, they're all basically the same. They're all basically the same. So I'm going to continue here. Again, Hamilton likes to write. Likes to hear himself writing. All three, from my reading, is when the Constitution says it can, and when the federal... Okay. Nope. I'm realizing this. The exclusive... Or the alienation of state sovereignty. So the states would only not be sovereign under their own terms where there's a power specifically given to the Union. That's right. Where sometimes the Union can do it, but the states never can do it, which is weird. And then the Union can do it, but it's not said that the states can't do it, but obviously if the states took a certain step, it would be, as he says, contradictory or repugnant to the Constitution. So certain cases where the Constitution doesn't outright explicitly say the states can't do something, if it obviously conflicts with the Union and the whole, like perhaps declaring war. It might not say specifically in a Constitution. It might. I don't actually remember off the top of my head. It might not say specifically a state can't declare war on a different country, but obviously that would be contradictory and repugnant to the whole Union. Good. Sorry I had to do a double take there. It's a fresh read, like I said. I use these terms to distinguish this last case from another which might appear to resemble it, but which would, in fact, be essentially different. I mean, where the exercise of a concurrent jurisdiction might be productive of occasional interferences in the policy of any branch of administration, but would not imply any direct contradiction or repugnancy in a point of constitutional authority. So here he's saying it might not be directly against what the Constitution says, but if the federal government's doing something and the states act in a way that counteracts what the policy of the federal government is, then that itself might be contradictory and repugnant. So it's not even specifically stated in the Constitution. It's, you get it, guys. This is not me saying it to you. What I interpret Hamilton saying is, you get it. If they're doing something and everyone's like, that's not right, even though it's not constitutional. Again, not necessarily easing the fears of many anti-federalists with this statement. These three cases of exclusive jurisdiction in the federal government may be exemplified by the following instances. The last clause, but one in the 8th section of the first article, provides expressly that Congress shall exercise exclusive legislation over the district to be appropriated the seat of government. So in his first example of why sometimes state sovereignty needs to be diminished in respect to the federal government, is that he's referencing the final clause in Article 8 of Oh, the final clause in the 8th section of the first article. So Article 1, Section 8, final clause. Congress has exclusive legislation over the basically District of Columbia, Washington, D.C., which I'm sure he's going to say, the state doesn't. The state that D.C.'s in, Maryland, right? Maryland, won't have any power over it. This answers the first case. Okay. So in a place where the Constitution specifically says the states can't do it, the people can. For example, running the federal capital. Continuing, the first clause of the same section empowers Congress, quote, to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. And the second clause of the 10th section of the same article declares that no state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any impost or duties on imports or exports except for the purposes of executing its inspection laws. So, for the second place where it says the federal government can't do... Okay, so his second example, this is what he meant. Not... Sometimes the Constitution says only the federal government gets to do this, except sometimes the states can. So, you can't collect taxes unless Congress says it can, or you can if you're going through inspection laws. Maybe. So it's like the Constitution has some places where it's not 100% clear. Hence, would result in exclusive power in the Union to lay duties on imports and exports with the particular exception mentioned. But this power is abridged by another clause, which declares that no tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state, in consequence of which qualification it now only extends to the duties on imports. So, even though one clause in the Constitution says, sure, you can sometimes lay duties on exports, in another part of the Constitution it says, no, you can't. So now it's only duties on imports, sometimes when Congress says you can. This answers the second clause. The third will be found in the clause which declares that Congress shall have power to establish an uniform rule of naturalization throughout the United States. Okay, so Constitution says that when it comes to becoming a citizen, only the national government can determine those rules and regulations. This must necessarily be exclusive, because if each state had power to prescribe a distinct rule, there could not be a uniform rule. So, while it doesn't say the states can never... Okay, it doesn't say the states can't make distinct rules for being a citizen of that state, but that would be contradictory and repugnant to the idea of the national government making an uniformed rule. What's interesting here, kind of a side note, they used to use the word an. They used the word an for an uniform, and here he used a uniform. I don't know why I find that interesting. Anyway, continuing. A case which may perhaps be thought to resemble the latter, but which is in fact widely different, affects the question immediately under consideration. So, now that we've gotten that out of the way, there is another question that Anti-Federalists keep raising that we really need to get to wholeheartedly. What does he mean? I mean the power of imposing taxes on all articles other than exports and imports. So he's going back to the state's ability to lay taxes. This, I contend, is manifestly a concurrent and co-equal authority in the United States and in the individual states. So we both have the power to lay these taxes, the states and the federal government. Seems like it might be contradictory, but let's see. There is plainly no expression in the granting clause which makes that power exclusive in the Union. So the federal government does not exclusively have the power to taxation. It does have the unlimited power of taxation, and Hamilton has argued that it should, but it does not have exclusive power of taxation. There is no independent clause or sentence which prohibits the states from exercising it. So there's no negative. There's nothing saying the states can't do taxes. So far is this from being the case that a plain and conclusive argument to the contrary is to be deduced from the restraint laid upon the states in relation to duties on imports and exports. So he's saying, because the Constitution makes such a big deal about the states not being able to import or tax imports or exports, the fact that it doesn't have anything restricting these taxes should make it all the more apparent there's no reason for the national government to prohibit the states from laying taxes. Many anti-federalists were afraid of. He's basically arguing that if that was the case, the Constitution would say, no, you can't raise any taxes ever, just like it says you can't have any imposts or export duties. To which the Anti-Federalists would say, right, but it also doesn't say we can. You're not making us feel that much better, bud. This restriction implies an admission that, if it were not inserted, the states would possess the power it excludes. And it implies a further admission that as to all other taxes, the authority of the states remains undiminished. So basically, continuing what I just said, I got a little ahead of him there. Okay, is this a very long sentence, or do I miss a period like usual? Pretty long. Okay. In any other view, it would be both unnecessary and dangerous. It would be unnecessary because the grant to the Union of the power of laying such duties implied the exclusion of the states, or even their subordination in this particular. There could be no need for such a restriction. It would be dangerous because the introduction of it leads directly to the conclusion which has been mentioned, and which, if the reasoning of the objectors be just, it could not have been intended. I mean that the states, in all cases to which the restriction did not apply, would have a concurrent power of taxation with the Union. So, just to sum up, he's saying that to the Anti-Federalist view would be unnecessary and dangerous. So if you believe that, as Hamilton said, the Constitution says imports and exports, taxes, very clearly, states can't do it, federal government can. But it says nothing about the other ones. So to assume anything that's not explicitly stated in the Constitution, as he pointed out, the federal government only has powers explicitly stated. To assume something that's not explicitly stated as one of their powers is still the case is unnecessary and dangerous. It's unnecessary because the grant to the Union of the power of laying such duties implies then there could be no need of such a restriction. So it's unnecessary because why? We can't put in absolutely everything. That's the point of it being explicitly stated in the Constitution. You're making assumptions about things that aren't stated, and we couldn't put in everything, kind of. And it's dangerous because it leads to the conclusion which has been mentioned. Okay. Because the states would have a concurrent power of taxation with the Union. So you're making the assumption that, I apologize. This is a very tricky one. Why don't we go through it a little bit slower? Forgive me if you're understanding quicker than I am. Okay. It is unnecessary. It implies that a further admission as to all other taxes, the states remained undiminished. So he's talking about the restriction. The restriction. So let's go back here. Sometimes you got to read along with me. Where does he first use the phrase restriction? Immediately consider posted taxes. Okay, so again, he's saying there's plainly no expression in the granting clause which makes that power exclusive. He's very important about the word exclusive. There's no independent clause or sentence which prohibits the states from exercising it. There is no restriction on the states from taxes. So far, this has been far from the case, that a plain conclusive argument on the contrary is to be deduced from the restraint, but restriction, laid upon the states. Okay, again, so since there is no explicit restriction on the states from taxing, then they shouldn't worry about not being able to do it. This restrictions applies that if it were not inserted, the states would possess. So again, you're restricted against imports and exports. So you need to collecting my thoughts. Let me take a sip of water here. Because there is the restriction against states taxing imports and exports very explicitly, it is the fact that it doesn't say there is no restriction on the state's ability to raise other taxes, you shouldn't be worried about it. It would be unnecessary and dangerous to believe so. It would be unnecessary because the grant of the Union of the power of laying such duties implied the exclusion of the states. So, as he's kind of repeating himself, or even the subordination, there could be no need of such a restriction. So again, it's unnecessary because why have a restriction against the federal government? There's a particular restriction on imports and exports, but there is no explicit restriction on... Man, I'm having trouble getting the words out today, guys. I apologize. Right, so it's unnecessary for what he said before. Why are we going to even write it down when there is no restriction against it? We can't put in everything you can do. We're just explicitly saying what you can't do. It would be dangerous because the introduction of it leads directly to the conclusion which has been mentioned, and which, if the reasoning of the objectors could not have been intended, I mean that the states, in all cases to which restriction did not apply, would have a concurrent power of taxation with the Union. So... Right. It's very strange sentence. It's the states in all cases to which a restriction does not apply. So in all cases where the restriction does not apply, this okay, yeah, if they didn't specifically say that the states can't import and export duties, then they would both be able to do that. Okay. It's kind of a lot of words to say basically nothing. Guys, first of all, I apologize for slapping my microphone there. I do apologize that it took me so long to get through that particular sentence. He doesn't say much. That's what was so challenging for me, is he doesn't really add anything with that whole conversation. Okay. As sometimes we've learned, he does. He just likes to hear himself talk. Okay. The restriction in question amounts to what lawyers call a negative pregnant. That is, a negation of one thing and an affirmation of another. A negation of the authority of the states to impose taxes on imports and exports, and an affirmance of their authority to impose. Nick, see, a lot of tongue twisters from Hamilton. Yes, Nick, I don't... Sentence bothers me. It took me so long because he doesn't say anything of substance. It's not that he's not saying anything, but it doesn't add a whole lot to what he's already said. It actually makes it just a little more confusing. So again, basically this restriction on the imports and exports, as he says, it's called a negative pregnant. That is, negation of one thing and affirmance of another. So you're saying one thing, you can't do one thing, which means you can do something else. A negation of the authority of the states to impose taxes on imports and exports, and an affirmance of their authority to impose them all on the other articles. So we've spent about 10 minutes on Hamilton twisting and turning and saying things that don't mean a lot just to get to basically this sentence. The idea of a negative pregnant. That when someone says you can't do this, can't do this, can't do this, can't do this, it implies that you can do this because you haven't been told you can't. As a parent, don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but I do believe he is the lawyer here, so I do believe him on that particular legal terminology. It would be mere sophistry to argue that it was meant to exclude them absolutely from the imposition of taxes of the former kind, and to leave them at liberty to lay others subject to the control of the national legislature. So, again, you're not being excluded from taxing, the states are not being excluded from taxing the people. Granted, the fear of the Anti-Federalists was that the federal government would tax the people so heavily, there'd be nothing left for the states to tax. Another long sentence here. The restraining or prohibitory clause only says that they shall not, without the consent of Congress, lay such duties, and if we are to understand this in the sense last mentioned, the Constitution would then be made to induce a formal provision for the sake of a very absurd conclusion, which is that the states, with the consent of Congress of the national legislature, might tax imports and exports, and that they might tax every other article unless controlled by the same body. So, the idea that the states can only lay these certain taxes with the consent of Congress leads you to a very absurd conclusion, as he says, that the government might permit states to do this, and that they might tax every other article unless controlled by the same body. The states with the... Okay, so they might get this... Okay, great. Again, not saying a whole lot. That, yes, they could have permission to do it from the states, and then they might both do it. Okay. If this was the intention, why not leave it, in the first instance, to what is alleged to be the natural operation of the original clause, conferring a general power of taxation upon the Union? So if this is what they wanted to do, why alleged to be the natural operation of the conferring a general power of taxation to the Union? Man, I don't see what he's adding with this sentence. It is evident that this could not have been the intention, and that it would not bear a construction of the kind. So, to summarize, the Constitution doesn't say you can't lay taxes. Dear states, the Constitution doesn't say you can't lay taxes except imports and exports, and sometimes the government might let you. He writes these every other day, if not every day. Not all the Federalist Papers are winners. This one that has a lot of words in it to say a very short thing, and sometimes Hamilton did that, and so far far from my favorite Federalist paper. As to a supposition of repugnancy between the power of taxation in the states and in the Union, it cannot be supported that in that sense, which would be requisite to work an exclusion of the states. So he's going back to what he was originally stating earlier in the paper. He said there were 3 situations in which there would be conflict between the power of taxation between the states and the government. He's going back to those to discuss the repugnancy between the power of taxation in the states and the Union. Cannot be supported in sense which it would be requisite to work an exclusion of the states. So basically, the major fear of the Anti-Federalists, as I mentioned earlier, he's getting to that here. The major fear of the Anti-Federalists when it came to taxation is that the federal government would just tax the states out of existence. They would lay taxes on the people to the point where the people had no money left to pay the states. And when it says you can have the unlimited power of taxation in all cases whatsoever, then why can't you just lay taxes on the states themselves until the states themselves are eliminated because they have no more money? And he's saying, to suppose that would be dumb. You're a dummy. Don't say that. It is indeed... Oh. 1 second. Got a little stink bug. It's getting warm out. They're coming in, landing right on the microphone. It is indeed possible that a tax might be laid on a particular article by a state, which might render it inexpedient that thus far a further tax should be laid on the same article by the Union, but it would not imply a constitutional inability to impose a further tax. So, it might happen that a state might be taxing something, and then the Union might also tax it, and that wouldn't be great, but the Constitution says you can, so we can really tax the people if we both want to. The quantity of the imposition, the expediency or inexpediency of an increase on either side would be mutually questioned of prudence, but there would be involved no direct contradiction of power. So this might not be prudent, it might be terrible, but totally legal. The particular policy of the national and of the state systems of finance might now and then not exactly coincide, and might require reciprocal forbearances. So this might happen, and we might need to, one or the other, not tax something that is heavily burdening the people. I wonder which one he thinks will back down. It is not, however, a mere possibility of inconvenience in the exercise of powers, but an immediate constitutional repugnancy that can by implication alienate and extinguish a pre-existing right of sovereignty. So repugnancy is the word of the day for Hamilton. It's not just the possibility of inconvenience, but the idea that the Constitution's, as he was mentioning earlier, it might not be explicitly stated in the Constitution, but if something is repugnant, if the states are taxing something, the states are doing something that they have the right to do, but it is stopping, as he mentioned in Capitals before, the policy of the national government, well, then we're going to have a little bit of conflict here. And those states might have to give up some of their sovereignty. Even though, again, he's saying it doesn't specifically say in the Constitution the states have to give up their sovereignty. He's saying they should. The necessity of a concurrent jurisdiction in certain cases results from the division of the sovereign power, and the rule that all authorities of which the states are not explicitly divested in favor of the Union remain with them in full vigor is not a theoretical consequence of that division, but is clearly admitted by the whole tenor of the instrument which contains the articles of the proposed Constitution. Again, Hamilton, being Hamilton here, using the big words, that's why we do this. The important phrase here is concurrent jurisdiction. It's usually used in a judicial sense, but it is a legal term at large. And it's basically kind of what it says, when two governing bodies both have authority at the same time. And this is a division of power that might happen in certain situations. And the states are not, as he said before, explicitly expected to do this. But in theory, the Constitution doesn't say they can. Again, he's kind of repeating himself with big words. He does this sometimes. We find that, blah, blah, blah. Easy for me to say. We there find that, notwithstanding the affirmative grants of general authorities, there has been the most pointed care in those cases where it was deemed improper that like authorities should reside in the states to insert negative clauses prohibiting the exercises of them by the states. So, again, as he was saying before, we're not putting in a lot of here's what you can't do. We're putting in here's what we're not saying anything the states can't do. We are only saying what the federal government can do. The 10th section of the first article consists altogether of such provisions. So, Article 1, Section 10 talks about this. This circumstance is a clear indication of the sense of the convention, and furnishes a rule of interpretation out of the body of the act, which justifies the position I have advanced and refutes every hypothesis to the contrary. Publius. Last sentence basically saying if you disagree with me, you're wrong. Founder fans, if you've watched through this long, thank you. I did have some struggles with this one, and the reason is Hamilton isn't saying a whole lot. He really is repeating himself kind of over and over again. He's saying there are certain situations that the states will lose their sovereignty. And in this case, it's the power of taxation that he is focused on. The states will lose their sovereignty in any way that is explicitly stated in the Constitution. And just because something's not explicitly stated in the Constitution doesn't mean the power is taken away from the states. If it were, it would be explicitly stated in the Constitution. The powers to tax imports and exports, explicitly given to the federal government, and explicitly, unless Congress changes its mind, taken away from the states. But he also, and most importantly, discusses the idea of concurrent jurisdiction, where sometimes, like taxation, both the federal government and the state government will have the power to tax the people, and sometimes they will tax the same thing, and that could be very bad for the citizens of the states. In that situation, Hamilton believes that if the state government's taxes are affecting the national government's, quote, policy of taxation, then the states should have a mutual forbearance, end quote, where the states step back and stop laying that tax in order to let the federal government carry out the tasks it's deemed necessary and proper to complete its tasks. Now, I said that in a very much more succinct manner than Hamilton managed to put it, and I have a feeling that one of the reasons Hamilton used so many words and made the paper a little bit more confusing than it had to be was because he was writing to the Anti-Federalists in New York, and at this time, 75% of the people elected to attend the ratification convention in New York the following summer were Anti-Federalists. Most people were. One of the things they didn't like was the fact that the federal government could just tax the people without regards to what the states were doing. And he's essentially arguing here that that's okay, that the states, that the federal government should be able to tax the same thing the states are, and if it's really not prudent, as he says, well then maybe the states should follow the, quote, policy of the national government and back off. Not necessarily what the Anti-Federalists want to hear, and therefore, as I said, probably why it's a lot more confusing than it has to be. With that, thank you so much for watching. I do appreciate it. Again, I was a little more tongue-twisted on this one than I've been in most of them, which I've been pleasantly surprised about how swimmingly things have gone until really this particular paper. You guys are the best. Thank you so much. If you haven't hit like yet, do me that favor and slam that like button. I should come up with some kind of found that like button down below and give it a bayonet it like it was a red coat. I guess I can't say that. I'll probably, not that YouTube is looking at my tiny channel, but I guess I could probably get when I get monetized, I'll get demonetized for that comment. Thank you guys. Sorry, Nick. I do apologize. It was confusing. I hope my summary at the end there was a little bit clearer. Either way, Federalist number 32. Big thumbs down. With that, we'll move on. I did it on Wednesday this week. Unfortunately, my spouse was out of town for a few days, and with me and the boys last night, I was kind of exhausted, and I just said, you know what? I'll do it on Wednesday this week. We'll be back to Tuesday next week. We are going to have something. Trivia on Friday. And I'm hoping to finish up my family tree by Saturday. I'm hoping. Because the family trees are fairly time consuming to make. And then it's just an hour, 20 minutes, and we're done with it. But it's fun for all of us. So thank you guys for watching. I will be back with trivia on Friday.